Hi guys, welcome back. We are continuing on with our data unit. Today we're going to learn about shape of data. So there's no math involved, but you do need to identify what type of data that you're looking at. So let's take a look. We have four things that we're going to discuss in the shape of data. Share. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look. So the four shapes of data that we're going to talk about are cluster, gap, peak, and symmetry. Let me see if I can zoom in. There we go. All right, so cluster, the data that is grouped closely together. Notice in our histogram or bar graph, see how there's no gaps? There's no gaps in this data. Everything is close together. That is a cluster. Gap, data that shows numbers without data value. So notice right here, there's a gap in our data from 6 all the way to 9. There's nothing above those numbers. So there's a gap there, okay? The next one is a peak, the most frequently occurring values. This is usually your mode, the number that appears the most. Look at this one. The arrow is pointing at the 8. The 8 is the mode here because it has the tallest peak in our data, okay? The next one is our symmetry. Symmetry is the left side of the distribution looks the same as the right side. So look at this right here. We have a box plot. Here's our median, our middle, and it looks the same to the left as it does to the right. So we have symmetry here, okay? Our data is even. Now, these are the four types of shapes of distribution, and you may have some that apply, you may have none that apply. It just really depends on how your data looks. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's look at this dot plot. Okay, notice, let's start from the top. Let's start with cluster. Is there a cluster of data? I would say so. All of our data seems to be together. So there is a cluster going on here. What about a gap? Is there a gap in our data? I don't see any gaps. So I'm going to say no gaps. No gaps. Okay. Is there a peak in our data? I would say so. I would say our peak was at 4 because that's the one that has the most X's above it. So I'm going to say peak is at 4. Okay. And then how about our symmetry? If we take on the middle of our data, I have 2 here and I have 1 here. So it's the same to the left as it is to the right. So there is symmetry going on here. Okay. So the only thing it didn't have was gaps, but it had the other 3 as well. Okay, let's look at this dot plot. Okay, so again, we're going to start with cluster. There is no cluster because we have spaces in our data. So there's no cluster here. Our data is not together. Okay, what about gaps? Do you see gaps in our data? We have a gap in our data at 3 and at 7 because there's no information there. There's a gap in our data here, okay? Now, what about our peak? Is there a peak in our data? We do have a peak. The mode is 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, because there's 4 X's above it. So our peak is at 5. And then finally, our symmetry. If we look at the middle of our data, okay, which is, we have 8, so 4 would be the middle. It does not look the same on both sides. So there is no symmetry here. No symmetry, okay? So we only had 2 of the 4 happening here. There was gaps and there was a peak, but no cluster and no symmetry here, okay? Let's look at this box plot. Now, it may be a little hard to tell with some of these with the box plot, but let's see what we can figure out. All right, do we see a cluster of data? Well, on a box plot, we really can't tell if there's a cluster of data. So I'm going to say can't tell. Can't tell if there's a cluster. Okay. All right, what about a gap in our data? it seems to be a gap because I have a star all the way out here and then everything else is over here. So I'm going to say my gap is between, that looks like 55 there, 55 all the way to 110. So I'm going to say gap between 55 through 110, okay? All right, is there a peak in our data? We can't tell if there's a peak because we don't know how many we have of each of these numbers. So again, I'm going to put can't tell if there's a peak. Okay, and then finally symmetry. So I'm going to look at the middle. Here's our median. It doesn't look the same on the left as it does on the right. So I'm going to put no symmetry here. All right, so the only thing we had going on this one is a gap. That was the only one that we could tell for sure from this box plot, okay? All right, the last one we're going to look at is a histogram. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on. First of all, is our data clustered? Yep, I don't see any gaps in here. So we have a cluster of data. Okay, what about a gap? I don't see any gaps, so no gaps. Okay, do we have a peak in our data? We have a peak right here, 10 to 14. So our peak is at 10 to 14. And then finally, symmetry. If we look at the middle of our data, is it the same on the left and on the right? It is. So we have symmetry. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is our notes on shape of data. Again, it's no math involved. It's just looking at the data and describing what it looks like based on these 4 terms. All right, ladies and gentlemen, head to your folder and do your assignment for today, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.